Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study of the Gospel of John this morning. We're continuing in chapter 7. Chapter 7 has to do with the Feast of Tabernacles and Jesus' visit there. Tabernacles is the third of three feasts centered around the agricultural cycle of Judaism. There was Passover, which recognized the beginning of the grain harvest in spring. There's Pentecost, which is 7 weeks later. It celebrates the end of the grain harvest. And then there's Tabernacles, also known as the Feast of Booths, Booths, which celebrates the harvest of tree and vine. It is called booths because bad weather and cold weather might require farmers to build booths or shelters to protect their crops. Theologically, tabernacles had other meanings as well. Tabernacles coincided with the autumn equinox, so their ritual practice recognized the dying of the sun. In other words, the end of summer, the dying of the sun. Furthermore, the time of year was usually a time of drought, so prayer for water replenishment or rain was included in their feast and in the rituals that they went through. Okay, for each of these three Jewish feasts, there was a requirement for the men, I think it was the men, to come to Jerusalem and worship in the temple. Chapter 7 is divided into three sections with the following headings. The beginning of the feast, which is verses 1 through 3, the middle of the feast, which is verses 14 through 24, and the last section would be the great day of the feast, which is the verse, well, I've got here, throughout the remainder of the chapter. Okay, I guess we'll just get right into it. We're going to see that there are three, what we might call scenes in this chapter. We've got one section that looks like think of it as scenes in a play. You'll see how that works as we get to it, but it's broken into three sections at one point in the chapter. So we'll see that as we get to it. Okay, let's look at verse 1. We'll get right into it. After this, Jesus went around in Galilee. He did not want to go about in Judea because the Jewish leaders there were looking for a way to kill him. Wow. Well, let's just start right off. He didn't want to go to a certain area because he didn't want to, it was not time for him to be killed yet. Okay, the NIV refers to the Jewish leaders here. Your translation may say the Jews. And as I've told you when we began our study, whenever you see, if your translation, if you're at the NIV, it goes ahead and translates it for you. Whenever it says the Jews, it says Jewish leaders. In your translation, it may say the Jews. It's not referring to the general Jew on the street. It's referring to the Jewish leaders. So whenever you see the Jews, most of the time in the Gospel of John, you could just change that to say the Jewish leaders to understand what we're talking about. Okay, the Jews or religious leaders of Judaism. They're not the general Jew on the street. They wanted to take the life of Jesus. That means they wanted to kill him. Jesus is well aware of the depth of hostility towards him. After the healing of the crippled man, the man had been crippled for 38 years, back in chapter 5, verse 16, they tried even harder, it says, to kill him after what they considered to be breaking the Sabbath and blasphemy. And that was back in chapter 5, verse 18. I'd like to remind you of who Jesus came for. He came for the Jews. If you recall, I've told you, we're going to see it as we go through, Very seldom in the Gospel of John, or in the Gospels anywhere, do you see Jesus talking to a Gentile. He is always talking to Jews, and that is because he came for the Jews to be recognized and accepted as their Messiah. But he knew, God knew, and he knew that they would not accept him, and that was going to lead to his death on the cross, which has always been part of God's plan for the salvation of man. All right, so let's go on to verses 2 and 3. That was just a reminder. So 2 and 3. But when the Jewish festival of Tabernacles was near, Jesus' brothers said to him, "Leave Galilee and go to Judea. Go to Judea so that your disciples there may see the works you do." That's what his brothers told him. Jesus had some brothers, and he had some sisters too as well. It's seldom mentioned. There are some verses here that indicate that. Despite the dangers, his brothers, his real blood brothers, wanted him to go to the Feast of Tabernacles, is what we're talking about. They reference the miracles or works, or his works, probably meaning a show of the power of the Messiah, not the sign of the Messiah. They want him to go they indicate they want him to go to show off, to show his power that he has, not to perform a work or a miracle, which we know really to be signs of who he actually is. All right, so let's look at verse 4 and 5. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. This is his brother still talking. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world. Sell yourself. Show yourself to the world. For even his own brothers did not believe in him. That's an important sentence to remember there. They, his brothers, see Jesus as wanting recognition as a miracle worker, not as Messiah. They see Jesus as really wanting to be a public figure, even though that's the furthest thing from Jesus' mind. They see that in him. They see him as wanting to be a miracle worker. They acknowledge his miracles, but they did not have the kind of belief which leads to faith. They were just seeing him. It's important to realize that they're just seeing him as wanting to sell himself. He should be able to sell himself to the public, get out there, show off a little, show the things you can do. And verse 5 clarifies, saying that they do not believe in him. And this is a big deal. His own brothers don't believe in him. How hard do you think it would be as a brother of Jesus to walk around in his shadow all of the time? Because of his power, he would always be the one people were wanting to talk to, wanting to see, wanting to clap their hands for, give accolades to, and all that. And we just have to stand off here at the side. So how do you think that would be? Probably there would be some jealousy, maybe even some grumbling about it. It's always about Jesus. We need to get the picture. They could possibly have the same view as the people of chapter 6, verses 41 and 42. Let me read that. Chapter 6, 41 and 42. At this, the Jews were there began to grumble about him because he said, "I am the bread that came down from heaven." They said, "Is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, 'I came from heaven'?" So most likely his brothers could be in that group. We know we got the same parents. How can you be different to us? That sort of thing. Nevertheless, even though they grew up being taught the scriptures, even though his brothers grew up being taught the scriptures, they did not learn with faith, so his brothers did not believe. They were just going through the motions of learning without meditating, without paying attention to what's being read and studied. And that's what we talk about Bible study today. It's just not a matter of, you don't pick this up and read it like a mystery novel you buy off the drugstore magazine rack. This is a book. This is a message that requires study. The same was true of the study of the law. You needed to pay attention to what you're being taught. You needed to meditate on it and dig for the deeper meaning. They didn't do that most likely, so they were not able to recognize Jesus for who he was. All right, so let's look at verse 6. Therefore, Jesus told them, my time is not yet here. For you, any time will do. Okay, he's still talking to his brothers. He means when he say his time is not yet here, he means that the ultimate full disclosure for Jesus has not come. For them, any time is good. For Jesus to get out there and show what he can do, any time is a good time. To take him by force, to be king at the feeding of the 5,000, or now, as his brothers suggest. They just do not understand. So let's look at verse 7. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify that its works are evil. This is good. You're going to see this is an indictment of his brothers. The world does not hate you because you are like as they are. You are like the world, so they don't hate you. Oh, they hate you. You're just like hating yourself. They're all alike, and so they don't hate you. They hate me because I have come into the world as light to expose them, to testify that they do evil, those who live in darkness and they don't like it. Also, those who live in darkness and those that live in darkness don't like it. They don't like it at all that I do such a thing, that I'm here to expose those who live in darkness. And why is that? Because they prefer the darkness. They hate God and they hate the things of God, which means his word, his people, and all the things relating to God. All right, let's look at verse 8 and 9. You go to the festival. I'm not going up to this festival because my time has not yet fully come. After he had said this, he stayed in Galilee. All right. He says, going up. I'm not going up. Remember, we've talked about that before, that they would say, I'm going up to Jerusalem. You see that many times in Scripture. When they talk about going to Jerusalem, they always say, I'm going up to Jerusalem. That's because Jerusalem was on a mountaintop. We talked about that. To get there, you always had to go up. From any direction, you would be going up. And that's what he's talking about. I'm going up. I'm not going up, he says. I'm not going up. I'm not going up to Jerusalem to the feast. I'm not going up as in the betrayal, death, and resurrection, and the ascension. He told them he was not going. He was not going to the Feast of Tabernacles with them. So y'all go, I'm not going. That's what he told them. All right. In verse 10. However, after his brothers had left for the festival, he went also. He told them he wasn't going with his intent to go. He went also, not publicly, but in secret. So he didn't want anybody to know he was going. And he's already said, because time has not yet come, he knows what would happen if they knew he was going. They've already talked about wanting to kill him several times. So he might be running into that if they knew he was coming. And he's saying, my time's not come yet. So he went to the festival by himself. His brothers take what he says literally, as usual, and they just assume he intends to avoid going to the festival. What we see here, Jesus intends to go alone and secretly, probably because it is required by the Jewish law. That's another thing I want to be aware of. This is one of this trip to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles is something that is required. Jesus keeps the law. So that's probably why he's going to go anyway. He just wanted to go alone. So let's look at verse 11 through 13. Now at the festival, the Jewish leaders were watching for Jesus and asking, "Where is he?" Among the crowds, there was widespread whispering about him. Some said, "He is a good man." Others replied, "No, he deceives the people. He's a deceiver." But no one would say anything publicly about him for fear of the leaders. It's very interesting. The Jews, in other words, the Jewish leaders, were looking for him. They asked, "Where is he?" The crowds were looking for him as well. They discussed and grumbled and agreed and argued. They discussed, grumbled, and argued about what kind of man Jesus is. Some said he was a good man. Some said he was a fraud, a deceiver. But the crowds did not speak publicly about him. The question of that is why. It says, for fear of the Jews. Let's look back at that. Very last part of verse 13. But no one would say anything publicly about him for fear of the leaders. What could they possibly fear? They feared that it's the Jewish leaders we're talking about. My Bible says fear of the leaders. Yours may say fear of the Jews if you study King James or some of the others. But they're talking about fear of the leaders, not the general Jew on the street. So why would they fear the Jews? This is a very well-concealed reason for this fear. The leaders were not going to kill him. They were not going to put him in jail. But what they could do that would be a devastating situation for the Jews would be to take away their temple privileges. They can do that. And the Jews don't want this because going to temple, the temple was the center of Jewish life. To take that away would be a devastating blow to them. So they're afraid if they start saying things publicly about Jesus, that could possibly happen to them. I also know that their unwillingness to talk openly about Jesus for fear of the Jews stands in contrast to Jesus' unwillingness to work openly, calling attention to himself rather than to God. All right, let's look at verse 14. 14 through 24. This is the first of the three scenes that I talk about the Feast of the Tabernacles. This is in the middle of the remainder of the Bible is in the middle. Remainder of this chapter is in the middle of the festival. This is the first scene, and we'll read through that now. We're going to study this scene to complete our study today. Then we'll study the other. We're going to actually, I think we studied two scenes here, and then we'll study the final scene as part of our study next week. All right, so let's look at verse 14 and 15. Not until halfway through the festival did Jesus go up to the temple courts and begin to teach. So this is the middle of the festival, the middle of the feast. Not until halfway through the festival did Jesus go up to the temple court. It means it's half over. All right. Not until halfway through the feast did Jesus go up to the temple courts and begin to teach. The Jews there were amazed and asked, "How did this man get such learning without having been taught? He's not educated. Where did he get all this knowledge?" The setting is Jesus teaching in the temple. the Jews, the learned guys, the guys in the know were amazed at how much he knew and seemed to be educated, because they knew he wasn't, because if he was educated, they would have been the one to teach him. Okay, then they ask, where did this guy go to school? Basically, to come across as one of so educated and polished. Where are his credentials? But they knew he had not studied with the rabbis, so he had none. All right, let's look at verse 16 to 18. Let me read those 3 verses. Then Jesus answered. Okay, this is all red letter, so these are the words of Jesus. Let's listen here, 16 through 18. Jesus answered, my teaching is not my own. It comes from the one who sent me. Anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. In verse 18, whoever speaks on their own does so to gain personal glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. Back to verse 16, he has no credentials. He's taught by God, and he's taught by God, the one who sent him. I want you to look at verse 12 through 49. We're talking about, where does Jesus get this stuff that he's teaching? John 12 verse 49 tells us explicitly where he gets it. 12 verse 49. For I did not speak on my own, but the Father who sent me commanded me to say all that I have spoken. Jesus was given the notes by God, gave them directly to him. He didn't have to make it up. It's not his opinions. It's not his ideas. They came directly from God. That verse 12:49 is very clear on that point, and Jesus is saying that as he was talking to these people. Verse 17, he says, I think this is interesting. He says his teaching comes from God. I'm not making this stuff up for my own glory. I'm not saying these things just to make myself look good. I hadn't bought a bunch of commentaries to study, to make sure you get all the big flowery words and all the deep meanings and all that. I'm going to give you the deep meaning, but I got it from God directly. Furthermore, you should know this, if what? If you choose to do God's will. And what is that? Believe in the one he has sent. That is why he is sent to the Jews, to gain their faith as the Messiah. He was sent to the Jews. His message is for the Jews. And the reason it is sent was for them to accept him as the Messiah. That is what we're talking about. That is the thing we need to keep in mind as we study through the Gospel of John, or any of the Gospels for that matter. Jesus came for the Jews. In fact, I'll make this statement. This statement was made to me once before, and it was so foreign to my where I was in my thought process and my understanding of the Gospels. If the Jews had accepted Jesus as Messiah, he would never have left. But God knew he would not be accepted. Jesus knew he would not be accepted. So he will come to the point where he will willingly give his life as part of God's plan of redemption. That's where it's going to have to come to, because he's going to be rejected by the Jews, and that plan of redemption is going to eventually go to the Gentiles, which will be delivered by Paul, which is a little later. Okay, so Jesus is telling them that if they accept him as Messiah, they would recognize where his teaching comes from. He says, my authority is conferred on me by God, not the ordination of man. He got everything he said chapter 12, verse 49 said, what I'm telling you, I got from God. It was commanded for me to give it to you, and that's what I'm doing. I didn't have to make my own notes. I got it directly from God, and that's why I'm telling you. That's where I got it. Okay, verse 18 see, he says, my teaching brings glory to God, not to myself. That's how you can know about. Let's look at that verse again. Whoever speaks on their own does so to gain personal glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. So he is teaching not to exalt himself, but to exalt God. All right, verse 19. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me? Whoa, that just seems like it comes out of nowhere. Why are you trying to kill me? Jesus basically says things are going so well, I think I'll throw in a few inflammatory comments. He's done that before. That's almost like that's what this looks like. He's saying, you teach the law, you break the law. Then he says, why do you want to kill me? He is referring back to the Sabbath debate when he healed the crippled man who had been crippled for 38 years. We studied that just a couple of lessons ago. They wanted to kill him then for breaking the Sabbath and for blasphemy, not for, the fact that he healed the guy completely had nothing to do with the goodness of what he did. They were saying, you broke the law and you've committed blasphemy. Remember, Jesus said he works on the Sabbath because he saw the Father working on the Sabbath. The things I see my Father doing, I do also, is what he said. So if God's working on the Sabbath, if something needs to be done, the right thing, that's what you're going to see me doing. All right, verse 20. You are demon-possessed, the crowd answered. Who is trying to kill you? Another very interesting verse. This is spoken by the crowd, not the Jews, not the Jewish leaders. This verse seems to validate what I have been saying. The Jews, the religious leaders, decide that Jesus is not the Messiah. Then they tell the people, this guy is not the Messiah. They're their leaders. What are they going to believe? The Jews decide to kill Jesus, but it's all on them, not on the crowd. The crowd has no idea. They listen to their leaders. Sounds like backroom politics. We're going to see as we go on that the Jewish leaders come to consensus. This guy is not the Messiah. We need to kill him formally. Okay, they're going to tell the people formally he is not the Messiah, and the people are going to believe them because they believe their leaders. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. All right, verses 21 to 24. Let me read those. It's all red letter. Jesus said to them, they just said, who is trying to kill you, is what the crowd says. Jesus responds to them. He says, I did one miracle, and you are all amazed. Yet because Moses gave you circumcision actually it did not come from Moses, but from the patriarchs. That's parenthetical. You circumcise a boy on the Sabbath. Now, if a boy can be circumcised on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses may not be broken, why are you angry with me for healing a man's whole body on the Sabbath? Stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. Here Jesus says, you keep the law. Then he gives a specific example. He's talking about, he doesn't specify it here, but they know what he's talking about. He's talking about He's referring back to this crippled man that he healed on the Sabbath. The man had been crippled for 38 years that he healed on the Sabbath. He said, you keep the law, giving a specific example. Then he says, yet I did one miracle and you are all amazed. Yet, because Moses gave you then he talks about this thing about circumcision. He says, yet he expands his example to circumcision on the 8-day-old boy as keeping with the law. The law specified when the newborn males were supposed to be circumcised. It's supposed to be on the 8th day on the Sabbath. He says that if you can allow this on the Sabbath, why can you not allow a complete healing of a grown man on the Sabbath? It's a valid question, I think. Jesus is not liberalizing the law, but fulfilling what the law was intended to do in the first place, bring renewal and redemption to God's people. Jesus has come to replace and fulfill what had been partially offered by Moses. He came to replace and fulfill what had been partially offered by Moses. You remember Jesus said, the two laws you really need to keep are to love God and love man. If you've done that, you fulfill the law. The law is summed up into those two commands. Jesus came to replace the nitpicking tedium of what the Pharisees have brought into the law to fulfill it. The law was never, this is one thing you need to understand, the law was never intended to be permanent. If it was, we'd still be living under it now. It was not intended to be permanent. It was never intended to be permanent. It was temporary until Messiah could come and show the true image of God. All right, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for studying with me.